Thank you, everyone, for attending the National Farmers Union's webinar series, NF University. Our presenter today is Nicolas Roux, and the topic is the colonial roots of modern free trade agreements. His talk will explore the colonial origins of modern international trade. Since the 1990s, the World Trade Organization, bilateral investment treaties, and free trade agreements have governed the international trade and investment regime based on free market ideology. But geopolitics, power relations, and corporate interests have shaped trade rules for over 500 years before they reached their current form. At the dawn of colonialism, an alliance between colonial states and companies developed international trade and mercantilism and shaped international trade and investment rules until World War II. Today's free trade policies reflect this colonial legacy. Understanding that history is essential to addressing the problems today's free trade agreements create. Nicolas Roux is the coordinator of bilaterals.org, a website that tracks information on free trade agreements and resistance to them. He also teaches free trade. He also teaches international trade at the University Jean Moulin in Lyon, France. He was the trade spokesperson for Friends of the Earth for France for almost 10 years and currently sits on the board of Attaque France. Please go ahead, Nicolas.
Thank you, Kathy, for the introduction and for the invitation. Shall I share my screen right away?
Sure, please go ahead, whatever you're comfortable with.
Sure. Okay, I think I need to, it's disabled right now. So I think
okay.
to be made
Sorry, yeah, look after that. Okay, you should be able to go ahead and share your screen now.
Okay. So
perfect.
Thank you. So it's really great to see so many people that are attending this lecture, workshop, event. So I'm going to be talking about the colonial roots of modern free trade agreements and more globally the modern investment and trade regime. And you can see this painting is actually a painting of the Dutch East India Company. It's a painting that you can see in Paris at the Louvre Museum if you ever go there. And the Dutch East India Company, I chose this painting because the Dutch East India Company is a central player to the emergence of modern trade rules. And I'm going to get back to that in a minute. So I wanted to start with a couple of quotes that kind of summarize what I'm going to be discussing. First one is from Karl Polanyi, who wrote in A Great Transformation in 1944, so it was like 80 years ago. There was nothing natural about laissez-faire. Free markets could never have come into being merely by allowing things to take their course. Laissez-faire itself was enforced by the state. And another quote by Yash Tandon, a Ugandan politician, professor, and activist, who said there are no such things as free or fair trade. It's a fiction first created by the English during the height of their mercantile empire in the 19th century. So this will be central to my presentation, meaning I'm going to try to deconstruct, the idea, the very notion of international trade. I'm going to try to see where it comes from, the roots, how it was shaped over the past centuries. But first of all, so a quick reminder, so everyone is on the same level. How is international trade and investment governed today? So there are three main international treaties, or international instruments that govern international trade and investment, the World Trade Organization, free trade agreements, and bilateral investment treaties. I'm not going to get too much into details, otherwise it would take a few hours rather than 45 minutes. But basically, the World Trade Organization was implemented in 1995, and there are three main pillars governing the organization: agreements on goods, agreements on services, and another agreement on intellectual property. And there are plenty of side treaties such as agriculture, sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, technical barriers to trade, and so on. So let's say what was original about the World Trade Organization is that trade wasn't only about trade anymore, meaning like exchange of goods and tariff. It was also about what we call non-tariff barrier, meaning norms and regulations. So that was a big step forward compared to what had happened since World War II. The second instrument is free trade agreements. A free trade agreement is an instrument that promotes international trade in goods and services by either lowering tariffs or non-tariff barriers. So basically, custom duties and norms and regulations, and also promoting foreign direct investment. And bilateral investment treaties. It's an agreement between two states ostensibly designed to promote investment flows and protect international investors from one signatory state and the investment to the other signatory state. So now we have these quick definitions. I hope they are clear enough for all of you. We can get into really the origins of international trade. And basically the questions we're going to be asking ourselves is, how do we go from this medieval market, this medieval era in Western Europe, where most people consumed, I mean, what 90% of what most people consumed was produced in a like 5-mile radius, to this very highly globalized world where basically we consume on a daily basis goods that come from all over the planet. And classic economics theory claims that everything was done naturally. It was like step by step, very gradual, because of the natural tendency of human beings to make profit, to trade, to barter, and so on. So basically, it started local, trade started like locally, and then it grew progressively, driven by like a small capitalist class into like more regional and national and international. So everything was kind of natural and progressive. But actually, if we dig a bit deeper into that, we realize that it's not exactly what happened. And actually, international trade was very much pushed by colonial states and colonial traders or colonial merchants, because they had obviously many interests in pushing this trade for many reasons. Profits was one of them, and also controlling the world, if I can speak like that, was another one, or like geopolitical reasons, if you like, for colonial states. So let's start the story in 1492. And so this is a painting of one of the many paintings describing Christopher Columbus arriving in what we now call the Americas. And maybe just a side note before I really get into it is like, obviously international trade and issues around international trade didn't start in 1492. Actually, international trade and foreign aggressions have been connected since always, pretty much. And if you look at anthropology writings and so on, it's very well documented, showing that even in ancient tribes or ancient civilizations, international trade could also be the product of foreign aggressions, violence, and so on. It could also be peaceful, but what I'm trying to say is like, it didn't start in 1492, but we have to start at one point. And again, we have 45 minutes and not 10 hours. So So I chose 1492 because it's not a random date, because of the reasons I just explained. It's Christopher Columbus arriving in the Americas, which will reshape the way the economy is governed. So this period of time corresponds to the rise of the Spanish century, so 15th and 16th century. And when the Spanish arrive in the Americas, there's obviously this quest for raw materials, which is a colonial pattern that we will see until today, pretty much. But what's also interesting is that at this point, you already had some lawyers, like Spanish lawyers, who were talking about freedom of commerce. And they actually came up with some rules that claim that Spanish invaders had a natural right to trade, like with the indigenous population. And if they weren't given this natural right, it could be considered like maybe not an act of war, but like a hostile act, and they could then retaliate, which is why also there were so many massacres in the region, because not all the indigenous populations were willing actually to accept the new, the invaders and what they wanted to do with the region. So that's the beginning of something that will, let's say, progress and develop even more in the years to come, which is, if you were like private entities coming up with rules around trade, which will become global. Because before you had rules, obviously, like governing trade and international trade and free trade, free ports, and so on. But this really, because we had new means of transport, it was easier to travel and so on. So it was much, let's say, it became much easier to go all over the world and to come with, invade different territories with rules of law as well, which led pretty much at the same time to the rise of the major colonial companies. And you can see here we have the East India Company, so the English East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the Royal English African companies, and two companies that maybe a little bit more in Canada, the Compagnie de Nouvelle-France, New France Company, and the Hudson Bay Company. And as far as I remember, there are still some stores called Hudson Bay Company in Canada, if my memory is correct. So these two companies were actually really instrumental in colonizing Canada, and also bringing these new ways of trading and this new capitalistic, let's say, way of dealing with economics. So the influence of major colonial companies didn't come out of the blue. And if we go back to the geopolitics of the 17th centuries, you had like many colonial powers, or like European powers, like France, the Great Britain, and the Netherlands. They were at war with one another. They kept fighting, and war costs money, and also war needs international networks if you want to really defeat the opponent. And the problem with these states is like they didn't have so much money and they didn't have any networks. So, and all of that could be provided actually with colonial companies. So that's why you had a sort of alliance between colonial states and colonial companies at this time. And so colonial companies could provide money and some networks that they had to help the states fight the other states. And in return, the states granted some rights to these companies. And since the colonial companies were the first to arrive in the new territories. I mean, what we call the new territories. Obviously, they weren't new for the people who lived there, but they were new to the Europeans. So the first purveyor of colonialism were actually not states, but they were really companies. And so when these companies were in these new territories, they were granted sovereign rights and privileges, meaning they could, for example, they could build forts, they could have armies, they could levy taxes, for example, and they could massacre all kinds of people, conquer territories, and so on. So they were like basically acting on behalf of the state. And because these companies were also competing with one another, some of them had quite quite aggressive strategies, if you like. So some of them, like the Dutch East India Company, started to develop some international doctrines that were favorable to them, and they were kind of justifying the aggressive behavior. And this guy, Hugo Grotius, who was a lawyer that was so brilliant at the time that he was barely 20 in his early 20s, that he was hired by the Dutch East India Company specifically to develop international trade doctrines that favored, let's say, the interest of the company. So basically, whatever the company was doing that could be seen as quite aggressive, like for example, attacking the fleet of other companies and so on, because Hugo Grotius came up with all these rules around the freedom of trade and so on. Basically, everything was legitimized and everything was okay, because it was international law. And his doctrines were so popular that they were actually adopted by many other companies after that in the years to come. And this was one of the first pillar of international trade. And actually, Hugo Grotius is still considered today as the one of the father of international law. So if you like, these companies, from commercial enterprise, they shifted to imperial acquisition and management. And because, as I said, they were really acting on behalf of the state in the colonies, which basically started to blur private and public interest, which is something that we still see today, actually. And but this is really the starting point of something that will become, until today, something quite normal and that we see all the time, like the blurring of private and public interest, and governments working hand in hand with transnational, now we would say transnational companies, and the consequence of that was that war, trade, and international law were intertwined. They were connected to one another. And an example of that is the first Opium War in the 19th century. If you're not aware of it, when China banned opium around that time, early in the 1830s, because opium had dramatic effects on the population, social effects and health effects. But the problem was that the opium trade was mainly done by the East India Company. It was a major player. So this ban didn't really benefit the East India Company, quite the contrary, actually. So a war was started by England against China because they thought that this ban was actually an attack on the freedom of trade, the freedom of trade that the East India Company should be able to have, because it's a natural right, again. So there was a war for 3 years. England won, and England imposed like what we call capitulation treaty or unequal treaty to China. And this is when Hong Kong became English. Obviously, the ban was reverted. and the East India Company, who was, by the way, helped during the war. They had mercenaries, they had an army, and so on. So they were like fighting as well as trading. And basically, they could resume their trade, the opium trade in China, which had again devastating impacts. So this led to the rise of, let's say, what we call now international investment law, which wasn't called like that at the beginning. But the 19th century is when you had more and more doctrines being drafted, being developed. And one of them, which was quite important, was the doctrine of the protection of the investment, which is something that we still see a lot today. Protection of the investment basically meant that whenever a country, let's say, was hostile to a foreign investment or didn't accept some investment or let's say could have like a hostile attitude against a foreign investor for whatever reason, even if it's a public interest reason, like it happened during the Opium War, it was considered as an act of war against the state, basically a hostile act against the state. So meaning that the state could retaliate against the ones that prevented, let's say, the investment, the foreign investment. So yeah, protecting foreign investment, that was, and there are many examples, like the French, for example, attacked Mexico when a bakery was looted in Mexico. French, they don't really when you attack bakeries, French bakeries, it's no joke in France. Croissant and all this stuff and bread. It's very important for us. So the King Louis Philippe, he sent the fleet to Mexico. Same thing happened in the US many times, and so on. There are countless examples. But this question of protection of investments also led to the internationalization of the judicial system. And you can see here, it's a picture of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, I think late 19th century. And the reason for that was that you can't really go to war all the time. War costs money, and also it costs lives. It's economically, it's not ideal. So the idea of internationalization of the judicial system was to create international tribunals that would pretty much decide, settle the dispute. Obviously, these tribunals were settling dispute based on European Western conception of like private property, private wealth, the environment, and so on. So they weren't taking into account the way indigenous populations were living or the way other people were living, and whether or not they had different values. No, this wasn't taken into account. But these tribunals were seen as very legitimate and very very impartial, if you like. And this was obviously the beginning of something that we still see today, and I'm going to get back to that in a minute. But the problem is that after World War II, decolonization happened. So many of these colonized countries became independent. And so the problem was like former colonizers, and especially for former investors in colonies, they had to protect their assets, the former, they were still the asset, but they had to come to ways to they had to be able to invest in those countries, or if they had already invested, which was the case, to protect these assets in these countries. So in those years, like the late 50s and the early 60s, and in the 60s, a few international convention treaties and so on were actually developed, and were enacted, were implemented to allow foreign investors, former colonizers, former colonial companies, to protect their investments in these countries. And since at the time you had the Cold War was happening and you had those two blocks, it wasn't generalized to the whole world because half of the world was on the US side and half of the world was on the Soviet side. But in the early 90s, when the Soviet bloc collapsed, basically all these rules were generalized to the world, were like extended to the whole world. And this is why you can see on this graph bilateral, these the number of bilateral investment treaties that were signed. And you can see up to the 90s, there weren't this many, they were like not many were signed, maybe under 50. And then all of a sudden in the 90s, you had this avalanche of bilateral investment treaties that are signed because everyone is buying into this new world order, this new neoliberal order. So like new countries, sorry, that came out of the communist bloc, they had to prove that they weren't communist anymore. They were ready to embrace this new capitalist world, So they signed all these treaties with pretty much all the countries. And now you have around 2,000, sorry, and 700 BITs that are in force. So pretty much every country has signed BITs with one another. And same thing with free trade agreements. There weren't this many free trade agreements until the 90s, and then it all started, and you can see more and more of these treaties were signed. One of them actually was signed by Canada. You've heard of NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, which is arguably the first modern free trade agreement. So now, how does the current trade and investment regime reflect its colonial heritage? And I showed this picture. It's a picture of people working on the railway in what was then called the Gold Coast, which is now called Ghana. Basically, this railway was meant to connect some minefield to the sea. So you could export like iron ores and so on. And this is actually something that you hear all the time, like colonialism brought infrastructures. And now again, trade and investment, it brings many things to the developing, the so-called developing world, infrastructure and so on. But very often we have to understand that these infrastructure were built actually mostly for companies to do their business, and rather than for the public interest. And it's something that you still see nowadays. Okay, this French-Israeli economist said that the international division of labor between central and peripheral zones is not simply the product of a random distribution of natural or factual resources around the world. It brings into play supply chains and distribution networks and a multifaceted hold of the center over peripheral production. So what does that mean? That means that during colonialism, you had this world economy, you had a center that had a center. Basically, the center was the colonial states, mostly Europe, but also the US, even though the US wasn't a real colonial power, so to speak, but it had an influence over the Latin America. And the aim of these colonial states was to shape colonized economies, so it benefited the colonial economy and the colonial companies. And this image is of Indian weaver. And before the British colonized India, India was actually had actually a very powerful textile industry, and they were selling all kinds of clothes and so on. And they were very, they had something that worked pretty well, actually. But when the British came, they changed this whole economy and they turned India into an exporter of raw materials that were sent to British factories. And the British factories made the finished products, so all the clothes, and then shipping them back to India. So India, from an exporter of clothes and textile product, it became an importer, which had actually dramatic impact, social impact, and economic impact on the country. And nowadays, you can see this pattern is repeating. We will see a few examples, but this pattern is repeating through free trade agreements where you want to keep some countries in the periphery. You want to keep them as not subject, but as you want to shape their economy so it benefits the economy of like largest power, whether it's the Europe, China, the EU, China, or the US, or even Canada. So I'm gonna take I'm going to talk about a few examples, and I've selected a few different key issues from different economic sectors, and one of them is agriculture and food. After all, it's an NFU event, so I thought it would be good to talk about agriculture and food. This image shows the trade route of the Dutch East India Company. And I've chosen this image because food actually has always been, food and agriculture has always been central to international trade. And at the time, trade in spices was actually something really, really important. And the Dutch East India Company was actually a leader in this trade around the world. So this is something that was central, and obviously it's still central today. I talked about the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, between the US, Canada, and Mexico that was implemented in 1994. And we very often talked about the impact in Mexico, such as the corn industry was very much damaged, becoming the local corn industry, because they had a flooding of highly subsidized US corn going to the country, being imported. And local farmers couldn't compete, over 2 million jobs were lost, which created like rural exodus and migration to the US and probably to Canada as well. But another example that we don't talk about as much is the avocado industry. Very often when you hear about international trade, you hear there are some winners and there are some losers in free trade agreements. And so when you talk about the way the corn industry in Mexico was damaged, some people say, yeah, but look at avocado, the avocado industry flourished. And it is true. The avocado industry flourished in Mexico. Mexico has become a huge exporter of avocados to the US and I guess to Canada, but I don't have the figures, so I will stick to the US example. But behind actually this claim, if you dig into it a little bit more, you can see that it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. If we look at it in more details, avocado imports were actually banned in the US between up to 1997, and the ban was overturned because of NAFTA. And now the US imports 87 of its avocados from the Michoacan region in southern Mexico, which is an increase of nearly 30-fold from 2000. And the area devoted to avocado orchards has more than doubled during the same period. So you could, on the one hand, you could say, okay, so it seems like the avocado industry did flourish and it did bring some benefits to the population and to the country. But if you look at the impacts beyond the economic impacts. Who's really, I mean, first of all, who's really winning from this boost in avocado? Not so much the population, but the population had to face the negative environmental changes such as deforestation, high water consumption, increased use of agrochemicals, and so on. And they also had to face a rise in violence linked to organized crime because the avocado industry was actually run mostly by mafia and local mafias and local crime organizations. So they were the one that benefited a lot from this avocado boom, and not so much the farmers. And again, this has been documented. I can send you the source if you're interested. You can get in touch with me, but this has been documented many times. Another example, trade and development. Okay, I'm not going to talk about the word. I could actually discuss the word development for like half an hour because there are many things to say about the very word. But one thing that you hear a lot is like trade, international trade, and free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties and so on. They bring development to developing nations. And one example of that is what the European Union has been trying to do with the economic partnership agreements with the ACP countries. So ACP is African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. So as you can see on this map, it's mostly former colonies. So some, yeah, they've been adopted. Okay. But the problem with EPAs is it highlights the contradicting positions of the European Union. We could talk about other countries as well, but like the European claims that EPAs will bring development, and African nations will be able to export more to develop the industries and so on. But at the same time, you're asking African nations to open the economies, to have a free trade approach to development, whereas their local industries are not as developed as the large European industries, as you can imagine. So you're asking these local industries, when you push for a free trade agreement with these African countries, you're asking the local industries, the infant or nascent industries, to compete with huge corporations from Europe, which is obviously, it's not like an even playing field. You can see that there are unequal competition here. And this is a contradicting position that you can see actually in many trade agreements. I use this example, but there are many other examples, History has shown one thing: nascent industries, they need to be protected, and that no country has ever developed domestic industries without protectionism. And if you look at the US, France, the UK, Korea, Japan, China, and so on, all these major players, which have huge industries, they've all started by protecting their markets and protecting them, I mean, in a drastic matter. So now, even though they developed by protecting the market, now they're asking developing countries with local industries that are developing to open the market and to have a free trade approach to market, which historically has never worked anywhere. Still, this is central to these agreements. So that shows, I mean, that brings into question what is the real objective of this trade agreement, and as I've shown with the India example from 19th century, there was really this idea of shaping India's economy, so it could benefit the UK, I mean, England. And what we can see with the EPA is like it really follows the same tradition, because like you can see a country like Kenya, for example, that just signed a trade agreement, like an EPA with the European Union recently. Kenya is like exporting flowers to it's not for the Kenyan people, no, flowers to Europe, green beans, and all these products that are made for European consumption, and that don't really not really used, consumed by local population, which is why, I mean, it's been criticized by many in Africa, or even in Europe as well, some economists and so on, you know. And for reasons like they maintain a colonial framework, you know, that enables corporations to extract raw materials, and they keep these countries in low value added production, and export primary product and products and so on. I mean, anyway, you have an idea of what I'm talking about. But in the end, do they really benefit these countries, and do they allow them to develop? Not so much. And you can see, actually, I mean, sorry, it's in French, but it's an article from a famous French newspaper called Le Monde, The World, where there was a scandal where all basically the lower value food products were sent to Africa, you know, because French people didn't want to consume them. You know? Another case, if we go back to India, for example, is the proposed EU free trade agreement that's being negotiated. And this also underlines inconsistencies in the EU trade policy that always claims that it wants these countries to develop, and that free trade agreements are win-win, you know. And this trade agreement includes what European negotiators call the trade and sustainable development chapters. So these trade and sustainable development chapters, and you can see them in other trade agreements under different names, but they are supposed to address all the problems that will be caused by free trade agreements, you know, and by like some kind of magical spell or something will redress all these problems. So on the one hand, you create problems, but on the other hand, you're supposed to address them in those chapters, which obviously has never worked, and is something that actually it's as old as the history of free trade agreements. And if we go back to NAFTA for a second, this was also a debate in NAFTA before Bill Clinton was elected president. And they also had to include some kind of something similar, like some kind of labor and environmental annex to NAFTA, which obviously 30 years later, we see that it didn't do anything. But at the same time, going back to India, the EU pushes India to open its government procurement to European companies because it's a huge interest for European companies. They want to have access to government procurement. So the European companies, they can build highways, you know, they can build bridges and so on, or they can have access to services for food, cafeteria, whatever. And but the problem is like government procurement in the developing world, but also specifically in India, is used actually to support some local industries, or to support like women's groups, for example, women corporations, I mean, women companies, small industries, village enterprises. So even though you include one of these trade and sustainable chapter, which is not enforceable, by the way, but at the same time, there are many provisions in these trade agreements that are a direct attack to the development of local enterprises. So all these companies, the Indian companies, they risk of being out-competed by developed companies that are much more powerful.
Nicholas,
So,
just a note for the time check. You have about 5 minutes left. Thanks.
Okay, so no, okay. Okay, so let's say so in the end, about does it really work, this trade and development, and whose development are we talking about? Are we talking about development of countries, or are we talking about the development of Western, or like, let's say, rich corporations, because we can also include corporations from non-Western countries. Okay, so maybe a quick example, and we'll try to be very quick, about investment protection. I talked about the internationalization of the judicial system in the 19th century. And the legacy of that is what we call today investor-state dispute settlement, which is something that is included in all these, in most of these free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties. So this system means that, this mechanism means that whenever a country implements a new law, even if it's public interest law for environmental protection or labor protection, whatever, even in the face of new evidence that shows that a new product is harmful to health, for example, the company has the right to sue the state before an arbitration tribunal because the new law affected its investment potential or its profits, or even its like projected profits. And so that's a direct legacy. And very often these tribunals decide in favor of the companies most of the time, because the tribunals are formed of private lawyers most of the time, people that come from the industry. And the basis of the decision is actually the trade investment treaty that whose provisions actually reflect the interest of the companies. They don't reflect the environmental protection, they don't reflect labor protections, and so on. And you can see like who are the states, like who are the cases. Sorry. When you look at the second table, you can see United States of America, the Netherlands, and United Kingdom. So most of the companies that sue the states, they come from these countries. And it's not surprising to see that all of these countries are former colonial powers. As I said, the US is not a former colonial power, but it has a huge influence on the Latin American region at the same time in 19th century and a recent case that's ongoing that really reflects what I've been talking about is a Prospera versus Honduras. Basically, Prospera had been given the right by the former government of Honduras to operate in a pretty much regulation-free zone. They had their own regulation, they could do whatever they want, and the new government decided to repeal the law that allowed Prospera to do that. And as a retaliation, Prospera decided to sue Honduras before an arbitration tribunal, and it's asking $10 billion US dollars. The case is ongoing, obviously. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to talk about all that. So maybe I'm just going to, as a quick conclusion, the economic impact of free trade agreements and BITs. And if you look at even the official figures, the US figures, that studied 14 agreements with 20 countries between 1985 and 2017. It brought 0.5 increase in GDP, which is pretty much not that much for almost 30 years, and 0.3% increase in employment, mainly for men with higher education. And there have been many studies that have shown that there is no empirical evidence that investment treaties and investment protection increase foreign direct investments. I started with a quote, so I'm going to finish with another quote from the director of the Globalization and Development Strategies Division at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. He said that free trade agreements are not free, they're not about trade, and they're not agreements. So they're not free because very much they are imposed. They're not free because actually when you sign them, you are not, you become like a prisoner of so many norms and regulations you cannot escape from. They are not about trade because it's not about exchanging goods. As I said, it's about rules and regulations, non-tariff barriers. And they are not agreements because they are imposed to states most of the time. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicholas.